In my attempt to find something unusual or different to say about him, I must admit that I ended up Googling 5 things you don't know about A.C. Grayling, and up came an article in the Telegraph from 2012. So these are things I have to say that I wasn't aware of. I didn't know that he was born in Zambia and went to school in Cape Town and in what was then Rhodesia. He didn't like school, so with the help of his classmates, he managed to raise 11 shillings and 5 pence for the 2,000-mile train journey home. But unfortunately, he ran away, but he was found by police hiding in a railway siding. The 4th thing I didn't know about him was that when he was 12, through boredom, he went to the local library where he lived, and he picked up an entire set of Plato's dialogues and settled down to read. And this really was a seminal moment in his life. And the 5th thing that he has said is that if he hadn't been a philosopher, he would like to have been a musician. And in his own words, well, I've already got the line main here. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome A.C. Grayling.
Thank you very much indeed. Oh, I was a bit interested to see whether there were 5 things about me that I didn't know. And nearly, that's an almost accurate description. I should just mention about running away from school. The reason for doing it, I was at a boarding school where the cane was very liberally used. And not that I was particularly naughty, but you know, some of the rules and regulations did seem not entirely rational to me. So the result was that I got caned quite a lot. And it got to the point where I had so many stripes and bruises and blood blisters on my backside that the next time I had to go to have a caning, I put a magazine down the back of my trousers, and it didn't hurt at all. But unfortunately for me, the housemaster study was just over a little lawn from my dormitory prefect study. And when I got back to the dormitory, the prefect came out and he said, "Was that you getting a caning?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "It sounded very odd." And I said, "For this reason," and I triumphantly produced the magazine from the back of my trousers. And he said, "You horrible little coward, how dare you do such a thing like that?" And he stormed out of the dormitory to tell the housemaster, who, by the way, used to like his glass or two of whiskey in the evening. And he came into the dormitory with his cane, and I'd changed into my pajamas by that time, and he gave me a thrashing at the end of my bed. The next morning, I couldn't get the pajama bottoms off because they were stuck to my backside with blood, and all these blood blisters had burst and everything. And I was really fed up. I said to my chums in the dormitory, I said, "That's it, I'm off." So I collected the money from them. Actually, it was 11 and 6 a packet of Marie biscuits and a bottle of water, all in a pillowcase. And that night, I set off home. Now, that's quite correct. Home was 2,000 miles to the north on the Congo border where my parents were living. So it was quite a long way away. And 11 and 6 didn't quite seem enough, which is why when I tried to buy a bicycle for 6, I was turned down. And so eventually, I was caught by the police and taken back to the school. And the thing is that when I was taken back to the school, there was a kind of terrible silence from my housemaster and the prefects and everybody, and they said, "You have to go and see the headmaster." And I thought, crumbs, because at the school there were the senior boys and the prefects and the masters, and then God, and then the headmaster. And I thought, well, this is going to be a bit sticky when I see the headmaster. If I get beaten for being late for chapel, what's going to happen to me for running away from school? And I walked into his study in great trepidation, and he said to me, "My dear boy, what is this all about?" Now, if I'd been a bit smarter, I would have recognized that he was more worried than I was, because if news had got out that a boy had run away from school because he'd been beaten too much and blah, blah, all the mums would have been a bit worried and the school might have taken a bit of a hit. Instead of which I said, "Well, I think I'd better phone my father and tell him what I've done." And he said, "Oh, no, we don't want to bother your father." Oh, if only I just got it. I could have said to him, "Okay, mate, give me a fag," put my feet up on his desk, and asked him how much it would have been worth not to say anything. Well, the one little silver lining of all this was that I didn't get caned for the rest of that term. And when I got home, I did fess up to my parents that I'd done this. And my mother said to me, "Well, if you're being caned so much, it must be because you're not behaving yourself." That was the extent of her sympathy. But Plato was a great solace, I have to tell you, in those palmy days. And it led to an interest in philosophy. We're all philosophers, by the way. You know the experience. You're in the pub in the evening. As the evening draws on, you get smarter and smarter. You discuss philosophical problems in greater depth. And we love to discuss these problems. But what we don't realize is that this instinct that we have, this drive that human beings have to inquire, to ask questions, to work things out, to disagree with one another, to learn from those disagreements. This is something that we extol in our education system. You know, there are some pushbacks to it now, especially in America. You see these awful bits of news from American universities where people want safe spaces. You know, they don't want any ideas that are uncomfortable to them. I think a university ought to be a safe space for free speech. This is where, you know, people really ought to be presented with ideas that differ from their assumptions, and where they learn other people's points of view, and where they are invited to assess and evaluate different ways of thinking about things and arguing for things. And that's really important. But this spirit of inquiry, of discovery, of challenge, of debate, has not been with us in our civilizations for very long. They existed in classical antiquity. This was why Socrates could go around Athens challenging his contemporaries to think about the ideas that they thought they lived by, the values that they thought shaped and colored their lives. And he was very keen to get them to scrutinize these ideas more deeply. And very often, in fact, most often, it turned out that their understanding of what they thought they knew or thought they thought was actually rather a shallow one. There's a famous case, and you can read it. It's a very accessible early dialogue by Plato called the Meno, in which a handsome young man, rich, wealthy young man, comes to Athens on business. Having transacted his business, he, in the absence of television and football, there wasn't a lot of either around in those days, he went to have a conversation with the philosophers under the olive trees. He wanted to ask Socrates a question, a really burning question of the day, which was, is virtue teachable? Can the upstanding citizens of our Corinth and Athens and Thebes, can they pass on their sense of upright life to their teenage children who were drinking too much ouzo and staying out late at night, stealing chariots, doing wheelies around the city walls, getting pregnant? I mean, really, those ancient teenagers. Well, this was a question he really wanted to ask. He asked Socrates, is virtue teachable? Socrates said, I don't know. And Meno was a bit taken aback. What? Well, why don't you know? And Socrates said, because I don't know the answer to a more fundamental question, which is what virtue is. Well, Meno's gasp was flabbered. What? Can you be Socrates and not know what virtue is? Socrates said, well, I don't. Do you? Meno said, of course I do. And Socrates said, well, thank God. Well, I've been looking all my life for somebody who knows what virtue is. Can you tell me? And every definition that Meno attempted was demolished by Socrates, who was intent on showing him that he really hadn't thought it through clearly. And finally, Meno said, you're like a stingray. You've stung my lips and tongue, and I don't know what to say. And Socrates said, good. Now that you know you don't know what you're talking about, we can begin to make progress. This is the good news I tell my undergraduates. I say, confusion, you see, is the beginning of wisdom. So if you feel confused about anything, you're on the right road. Well, this idea of free inquiry, free speech, challenge, discussion, debate, ideas being exchanged and explored, that was something that just seemed native to the classical mentality for those people in classical times who were enfranchised, which was, of course, just the adult males and not everybody else, not the women and the slaves. But that was an approach to life and a thinking about life that was the possession of very few and very privileged people for many, 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 many centuries, right up until the birth of the modern. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, what do we mean by that phrase, the birth of the modern? How is it that ideas first came to be liberated and discussion about them was once again possible in the way that it had been in the agora of ancient Athens? And just recently, I've been spending some time thinking about this and just written a book about it, a book called The Age of Genius, because what I wanted to do was to show people that our historical interest in the development of ideas, and I should just make a little footnote remark here and say, if you are a paid professional in the teaching and research of philosophical ideas, as I am, it's a great privilege and a great joy to be so. One of the things that you're very interested in is where ideas come from and how they evolve and what discussions move them on. Because ideas are the great cogs of history. Ideas are what change history. And so I'm really very interested indeed in this rediscovery of the classical spirit that enabled people to inquire again, to explore, to discover. And of course I found it in the 3 centuries, the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries, which really gave rise to the world that we're familiar with now in many ways, both positive and negative. But people think of the 16th century as the period of the Reformation and of the 18th century as the period of Enlightenment, quite rightly. These are very general and rather overgeneral labels, maybe. But as a result, they tend to diminish the importance of the 17th century, which is surprising because the 17th century is an extraordinary period of great genius. If you just list the names of people who lived, wrote, thought, explored, researched in that century, all the way from Galileo through Gassendi and Huygens and Boyle and Roche to Newton. If you think about the philosophers, Descartes, Spinoza, Locke, Bacon, Malebranche. If you think about the contributions to literature, not just in English literature, from Shakespeare through Marvell, Donne, Milton, and so many others, but in France, in Germany. If you think about this century, you see that it is a century bubbling, a great ebullition of genius and creativity. And yet, it was a century that had in it only 3 years of peace. It was a century of tumultuous change and war. And indeed, it had in it the greatest and most destructive war that Europe had ever experienced to that date, the 30 Years' War. The trigger for which began with the famous defenestration of Prague, you may remember, in 1618, and ended with the treaties of Westphalia in 1648, which created the Europe of the nation states that in the next couple of centuries anyway was so fruitful in conflict and war and division and dissension. Now the question therefore is, how could it be that in so conflictual and tumultuous a time that there could be such a great flourishing of genius? And that was the question that I addressed in writing this book, The Age of Genius, to work it out. Now, in order, of course, to leap over the bar at high jump, you have to take some steps back. And indeed, we have to go back into the 16th century, into the very late 15th century, indeed, just to begin to see how, in the late medieval period, and especially in the Renaissance itself, the seeds of these great changes began to push their way up through the soil of history. Now, in 1492, and everybody knows that in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and much to the surprise of the people who lived there, discovered America, you may remember. It was also, of course, the year in which the Catholic monarchs of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, drove away the Moors and the Jews finally from the peninsula. But in that year, a very significant little thing happened, the importance of which wasn't realized until later. And that was the publication of a little book called De Erroribus Plinii, on the errors of Pliny, by a man called Leonicini. Now, Pliny the Elder had, in the early part of the first millennium, produced what for centuries upon centuries was regarded as the definitive encyclopedia. If you wanted to know anything, you went and consulted that work. And it was known as the Natural History. It still retains some interest, by the way, apart from the insights that it gives to what people thought and believed in Pliny's time. But in Book 36 of the Natural History, Pliny, talking about the great painter Apelles, the greatest painter of ancient times, he says of him, Apelles could command the wealth of a small town for one painting. Plus or change, we're still paying a lot of money for art. So it just shows you that even in those days, that's how things were. But because the printing press had been discovered in Europe anyway, and had really taken off extremely rapidly, within decades there were printing presses all over Europe, and tens of thousands of printed volumes were being produced right towards the end of the 16th century, people were making new editions of ancient works. And Leonicini was busy trying to tidy up the text of the Natural History by Pliny, and he noticed lots of mistakes. At first he thought they were the errors introduced by scribes copying manuscript versions of the Natural History earlier, but he then pretty soon began to see that there were just loads of things that Pliny really didn't know anything about. Not his fault, he just didn't have the means to find out about them, and therefore he had said supposititious things or legendary things. And so he started to annotate all these errors in Pliny and eventually wrote this little book. Now, the fact is that people at that time were still thinking of ancient times as a golden age. And the thinkers and the philosophers and the prophets and the seers and the poets of that golden age knew more, saw further, were greater men and women than people of later times. That history had been a declension from greatness into something much less. And this was, of course, a generalization to history of our own experience of life as human individuals. When we're little, people buy us ice creams, drive us around, we don't pay taxes. When we get bigger and older, we do pay taxes. Nobody drives us around, and we have to buy our own ice cream. So, of course, things have got worse. So we generalize this to history as a whole, and we think that history is a great story of decline. But Leonicini recognized that this can't be so, because he knew better and more than Pliny did. And this consciousness that actually the possibilities of knowing more and better than the ancients began to seep into the consciousness of Europe among some, especially among those known as the humanists, interested in the literature and ideas of ancient times, and republishing them and then commenting on them, and then beginning to do their own work of thinking and hypothesizing on that basis. So that was one little seed that we can think for ourselves, and indeed we need to reprise the work of discovery and inquiry for ourselves. That little seed had been planted. But then, of course, the really important thing happened, which was Luther. In 1517, nailing his theses to the church door in Wittenberg. Now, you remember that one of the principal things that Luther was displeased about in the practice of the church was the Sale of Indulgences. This was that you could pay a bit of money and get some time off purgatory. You know Bernie Madoff, he of the Ponzi scheme? People have often pointed out that his big mistake was not to take any lessons from the church. What Bernie Madoff did was to promise his returns in this life. And that was what got him into trouble. Whereas the church was selling you time off purgatory when you were dead. And of course, there's no comeback if you didn't get the time off. And this was a very good way of financing the building of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. That beautiful structure was financed by the Sale of Indulgences. Well, Luther objected to that, and he objected to a number of other things. He protested against it, and that was the beginning of the Protestant movement, which caused tremendous rift in the church, of course. The Protestants in Europe quite soon began to divide among themselves, Zwingli and Calvin, and there were lots of Protestant movements. Calvinism, much later in the century, and Lutheranism came to be the two main forms of Protestantism in Europe, and they were just as antipathetic to one another as both were to the Catholics and the Catholics to them. The Catholic Church instituted a counter-reformation in the Council of Trent in the middle of the 16th century, and they set up this great intellectual army, the Jesuits, to serve as the vanguard, trying to recover for the faith those who had been lost to Protestantism. Now, the point is this. The Catholic Church is, it sort of takes a view of heaven as a kind of massive bureaucracy. You know, there are saints and the Virgin Mary and so on. There are various people you can get to intercede for you, carry messages to the deity on your behalf and so on. Whereas what the Protestants thought was that each individual man or woman is his or her own priest before God, that your conscience is your own, and you should be completely independent of any reliance on a priesthood and a hierarchy of saints and of angels and archangels, and of intercession by the Virgin or by the Saviour to the deity. This is a very different view of the nature of the relationship between human beings and the deity. Now, this idea of freedom of conscience, liberty of conscience, that you are free to make a decision, became an important crux, really, in Protestant thinking, and in those parts of Europe which had gone over to the Protestant cause, mainly Northern Europe, because there was a very fraught moment when a man called Michael Servetus was burned at the stake by Calvin, not by the Catholics, but by Calvin in Geneva, for disagreeing with Calvin on the question of the Trinity. What had happened was that Michael Servetus had taught himself Greek. He had read the New Testament in its Koine Greek, found that there was no scriptural basis for the Trinity, wrote a book to that effect, sent it to Calvin. Calvin, very dismissively and haughtily, didn't bother to address Servetus's arguments, but just sent him a copy of his own great work, The Institutes, in which Trinitarianism is supported. Servetus, irritated in his turn, wrote lots of rude comments in the margins of Calvin's book and sent it back to him. And Calvin was very, very annoyed indeed, and he said to a friend, he said, if this man ever sets foot in Geneva, he will never leave it alive. And Servetus made the terrible mistake of going to Geneva. He was arrested, tried, burned at the stake. Now, at that time, Calvin had got the good offices of a man called Sebastian Castellio, who wrote very, very beautiful Ciceronian Latin. As you know, Cicero was the great model of a Latin prose stylist, all the way through late classical times and right through the Renaissance into modern times. And the Protestant churches wanted a new translation of the scriptures in very, very good Latin to be a model for children at school. And Sebastian Castellio was busy at that time making this translation of the Bible into this lovely Latin. In fact, his book remained a textbook for Latin for several centuries after his own time. Well, when he heard that Calvin had put to death the man who disagreed with him, he was outraged. And he wrote a letter, an open letter to Calvin, which was published and disseminated all around Europe, which said, how can you claim for yourself liberty of conscience, to think for yourself in matters of religion, and kill somebody who disagrees with you? How can you do it? And this idea that nobody has the right to tell somebody else what to believe or think, and that everybody is free to think for themselves, that idea immediately caught fire in the tinder of the time. And the tinder of the time was that people in the Protestant parts of Europe, at any rate, who thought that they had this freedom, thought that this freedom should be extended beyond matters of their personal faith. But the freedom to think in matters of religion is surely also the freedom to think in any matter, about history, about nature, about science, about philosophical ideas. And the Protestant parts of Europe came to be such that in the later part of the 16th century and into the 17th century, the idea of freedom of thought and inquiry, a much more general idea of intellectual liberty, took hold. But the first fruit of that liberty was not science and philosophy as we know and love them now. It was a renewed and incredibly flourishing interest in magic and astrology and the Kabbalah and Hermeticism and alchemy. All of a sudden, people were trying all sorts of things because they were free now. You can be burned at the stake for doing alchemy or astrology. So they were free to do these things. And boy, they went for it big time. And some of the people who got into it became famous all over Europe. Dr. John Dee, an Englishman, became celebrated across Europe as a great magician, as somebody who people thought had really managed to crack the secrets of nature and had achieved great alchemical results and even indeed spoke with angels. Now what these people, these alchemists and Kabbalists and Hermeticists were trying to do was they were trying to get hold of the secrets of nature in order to be able to transmute base substances into gold, obviously very desirable, and to live forever or to keep their youth for as long as possible. The logic behind what they were doing was impeccable. If you thought that all material things are made of a certain number of elements, for example, earth, air, fire, and water, then if a piece of lead is made of earth, air, fire, and water, can't you break that piece of lead down into its elements and reconstitute them into gold? Because gold is made of earth, air, fire, and water, just in different proportions and arrangements. So this is what the alchemists were busy trying to do. They thought gold was especially good stuff, obviously. They didn't want anybody else to be able to turn base metals into gold. That's why they kept their secrets to themselves. They even thought that because gold is such great stuff, that if you drank it in liquid form, it would cure all ills. It did, by the way. People who drank gold very rarely had any other diseases afterwards. So this was what was happening. Among the alchemists and the Hermeticists, they were busy doing this. But of course there were people, sensible, rational, careful minds, who saw that in amongst all the nonsense that this was producing, because a great deal of it was obvious nonsense, there were some things coming out of alchemical and astrological and hermetical investigations that were really quite interesting. Out of alchemy came chemistry. Out of astrology came astronomy. Out of magic came medicine, or advances in medicine. But the great key was, how do you separate the sense from the nonsense? How do you separate alchemy from chemistry and the good bits of the other inquiries from the bits that were going to lead nowhere? So one of the key things that happened in the Protestant parts of Europe was that the more careful and sober-minded thinkers began to investigate investigation. They began to investigate the question of method. And there are two towering figures in the early 17th century who addressed this matter and made a huge difference to what followed, because they had recognized that there were things of value that could be selected out and promoted, which would really lead to substantive knowledge about our world and ourselves. And these two towering figures were René Descartes and Francis Bacon. Now, everybody's heard of René Descartes. His great slogan, "I drink, therefore I am," is on every pub wall in the country, so everybody's encountered him at some point or another. And his very first publication was a book called A Discourse on Method, on how you inquire. What are the steps that you take? How do you start? What can you do in evaluating your first premises? And how do you proceed from there with your inquiry? He did this on the model of mathematics and geometry, which, as you know, is an a priori, mathematics and geometry a priori sciences, and they work by deduction, by deductive inference. And so he is sometimes regarded as the great inheritor of the rationalist tradition, as it's called in philosophy. Plato, of course, is the grandfather of the great rationalists, thinking that pure thought could arrive at truth. Francis Bacon, however, said, we must look at nature. We must go and inquire. We must look at what the carpenters are doing and what the farmer is doing. We must get their understanding of how nature really works. We must put nature to the test. We must get the facts. We must observe. And we must work out from these empirical inquiries an understanding of how things actually are out there in nature. His empirical approach is what makes him celebrated by the founders of the Royal Society, which, when it got its Royal Charter in 1662 in London, cited Bacon as the great influence over them, because he had said three things of great importance. Firstly, go to nature, get the facts, be empirical, look for the data, and do your work on that. That was point number one. Point number two, instead of keeping what you discover to yourself, as the alchemists were doing and the astrologers and hermeticists, because they didn't want anybody else to know what they had managed to discover or could do, everybody must work together, must share their ideas, must pool them, must offer their ideas to others and have those ideas tested and challenged, because this is the way for progress to be made. That is why in the second half of the 17th century, the Royal Society in London and a number of other institutions in Europe began to bring inquirers together so that they could share and discuss and pool their resources, and the wheels of science really began to spin as a result. And the third thing he said was, and he did this repeatedly in a number of works, he said, not only must our savants and inquirers and philosophers and scientists come together to discuss, but we must provide real opportunity for them. We must fund this. We must build institutions where this kind of work can be done. He called it a house of Solomon. We must build a house of Solomon, a house of wisdom, really meaning a research institute, a scientific institute for inquiry. And indeed, that is what the Royal Society itself became, a house of Solomon, a place of shared and pooled inquiry where really great progress could be made in the sciences. So these two men, and their contribution really to thinking about how to really get the true gold out of the ore of this ebullience of inquiry in the Protestant parts of Europe, played a really significant role in advancing things. But I mentioned the war. Don't mention the war, people say, but in the case of the 17th century, you do have to mention the war, the 30 Years' War. The Emperor Ferdinand II, the Holy Roman Emperor, was a very, very devout Catholic, and he had a Jesuit confessor, a man called L'Amour Maini. And L'Amour Maini said to him, you will secure your place in heaven at the footstool of God if you will recover all those lost souls, the souls of those who have become Protestants. And so he took the first opportunity that he could to try to win back the Protestant parts of Europe at the point of the sword. The main motivation was religious, but of course there were many other considerations too, naturally. The Protestant parts of Europe had very wealthy lands which would have produced tithes and revenues for the Catholic Church if they could be recovered. In the year 1618, the estates of Bohemia, and Bohemia at that time was a Protestant country, decided they didn't want Ferdinand as their ruler any longer. And so they said, right, you're not our ruler, we're going to choose our own king. And Ferdinand sent 2 ambassadors to Prague to tell the Bohemians to behave themselves. And the Bohemians threw them out of a window in Prague Castle. This is the famous defenestration of Prague. And these 2 ambassadors landed in a rubbish dump about 30 feet below the window. Their pride was bruised much more than any of their limbs. It was put about by Catholic propaganda that they'd been caught by angels and lowered into the rubbish dump, which is a detail that always surprises me, since if you're going to be caught by an angel, why into a rubbish dump? But anyway, that triggered the 30 Years' War. And the important point about the 30 Years' War was it was devastating. It absolutely ruined most of Europe. Great armies swarming backwards and forwards like locusts, burning cities to the ground. And a terrible thing happened in Magdeburg in 1630 when every single inhabitant of that city, 30,000 of them, was slaughtered and their city burnt to the ground. But the devastation of Europe was absolutely terrible. The central parts of Europe. It is said that 1 out of every 3 German-speaking people of Central Europe died, either directly or indirectly because of that terrible war. But alas and alas and alas, wars always have little silver linings attached to them too, because they speed up social change, they speed up technological development, and in the case of the 30 Years' War, the breakdown of controls, the breakdown of borders, the breakdown of border posts meant that people and letters and ideas could travel around Europe much more easily than they could when everything was very strictly controlled by the powers that be. And so one thing that the war did was to open all the bottles, all the doors, all the windows of Europe. Ideas and people exchanged and moved around. And these great developments that were happening in science, in philosophy, in literature, in thinking about society, as we see by the outcome in the late 17th century, with what happened in England with the Glorious Revolution, the writings of John Locke, the discoveries of Newton, the effect that this great change of the 17th century had in producing the 18th century Enlightenment was a very dramatic change, and it has been instrumental in bringing about the world that we are now familiar with. And I end on this point. 400 years ago, at the beginning of the 17th century, we, all of us here in this room, would not have had anything like the potential, the privileges, the possibilities that we have. The only people who could live as we do today were the richest aristocrats and the most senior clerics of the time, a tiny little fraction of the population. But because of the liberation of ideas, because of the development of societies, of technology and economies, because of the flowering of all this hard work that was done in the 17th century in the form of the 18th century Enlightenment, with ideas of rights and the rule of law and democracy, change of institutions, the spread of literacy and education. Because of all this, we are here today in Wellington College, able to talk about these things, and not one of us is going to be burned at the stake later today. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. We've got 5 minutes for questions. Everybody's got to talk fast. Anybody like to ask? Any questions, comments, or complaints? Yes, there's a gentleman there.
Hello. Do you buy into this idea that, in a way, kind of like European civilization and the sort of explosion of the West, as we could call it, is at least sort of partly down to the emergence of open discussion in the kind of ancient Greece?
Very much so. And I do think that the liberation of thought, inquiry, discussion, exchange of ideas that is so distinctive of this period I'm talking about really is very, very fructifying. People say, this is a very Eurocentric view you're taking, just talking about Europe, but you know, at that point, in that period between the 16th and 18th centuries, Europe was globalizing. It was, trading all around the world. It was establishing colonies. It was taking its civilization, its religion, its views about things to other parts of the world, and in many cases, of course, forcing them on other people. But this was the moment at the beginning of the modern history of the world where it's, characteristically and distinctively European ideas and attitudes were really being exported. And so in order to understand much of our world now, with the exception of the societies that were then resolutely closed, like the Chinese and Indian society, but in understanding how the world has developed to today, we really do need to look at the roots of these developments at that period. Yeah.
Could you very quickly encapsulate what you think are the biggest threats to this tradition of openness and enlightenment? Is there one or two things rather than a whole list?
Yes, the opposites. Closing borders, closing minds, closing down discussion, stopping cooperation and sharing. We had a discussion about this in recent weeks, but that I think is the big risk.
Anyone else?
So I've got a whole series of FBI lights shining in my eyes here. It's about to tell you the truth in a minute. Yeah, hello.
Hi. I was wondering specifically on that point, what do you think about the emergence of like the idea of safe spaces and around universities, almost enclosed echo chambers? Do you think that's a threat to, like a serious threat to critical thought?
Yes, so the question is, what do I think about the emergence of all this safe spaces stuff and anxiety? Well, I said at the very, very beginning of this disquisition that I think a university should be a safe space for free speech. I think people should be open to uncomfortable ideas, to challenges. I can completely understand the very legitimate and rather worthy, noble, indeed, intentions that lie at the source of thinking about what's PC and what isn't, which is to try to be non-discriminatory and more inclusive and to respect difference and to let everybody have their say and have their place. But if it goes too far, and it has gone way too far, I mean, there are quite literally some universities in the United States now have set aside rooms, and I kid you not, with soft pillows and teddy bears, where if you are upset by something that a professor says in a lecture, you can go and sit there and you can do this for a bit until you feel better. And there are now systems in place in some universities where you can complain. Just this week, there were complaints about a professor at a university in Arizona who had asked his class to consider the arguments on the other side of a particular issue. They complained about him to the university administration. Well, I mean, I think this thing is dreadful. It is going back to the time when a controlling orthodoxy said what was legitimate and permissible and shut people up if they had different views or if they wanted to ask questions about what was regarded as legitimate and permissible. And we certainly don't want to go back there because those were the dark ages.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
I think you're right. What's to blame for the rise of the space and trigger warnings and Generation Snowflake and all this stuff? Whose fault is it? Is it perhaps ours for indulging it?
Well, it may be the confluence. These things always have multiple causes, and they will be complex. But if one were to pick out two main threads among all the threads, one would be the fact that this discourse of inclusivity and sensitivity to others, which is the good part of PC, of trying not to discriminate and to give everybody their chance, that has become overripe, and it has now become, something where you can instantly shut people up by claiming to be offended. The whole sort of, offense repertoire. But the other thing is, it sounds like the most tremendous cliche for those of us who are over 21 will say, well, when I was a kid, I used to ride my bike around the streets and nobody worried about me being kidnapped or run over or shot or blown up by terrorists or anything. And now, we don't let our kids out of doors. We watch them carefully and we nurture them, nourish them, and protect them. And the point is sometimes now being put that we have made our own offspring incapable of resilience, that they can't take things that are too challenging or which are threatening or demand of them that they be robust. So it could be that these two things have come together on the overripe, the offence agenda now on the one hand, and the lack of resilience on the other. So if you lack resilience, then you're going to be easily offended and alarmed by lots of things. And in order to protect yourself from that, you have to put in place this barrier to the openness of speech and inquiry and discussion. Very, very bad thing, and I think we should all work very hard to stop it from going further. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.